Welcome back to the DRH show. I'm thrilled to have with us today an expert whose transformative work in addressing the lasting impacts of institutional care has made a profound difference. He's the co founder and project lead of Seen and Heard, an initiative led by ex boarding school pupils committed to helping others heal from the unique challenges of these environments. Chris Braitch, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Yeah, I'm really grateful for you to give up the time to talk with me today and hear a little bit more about Seen and Heard and the work we do.
So, Chris, tell us a bit about your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dennis. Yeah, for me, Seen and Heard, we support the well-being of past and present pupils of boarding and independent day schools and their families. And so, naturally, for me to be passionate and know about that sort of area, I went to boarding school myself. I went at 7 years old. I boarded from 7 to 13. Then was a day pupil at an independent school, 13 to 16, and then came out into state sixth form college. So I kind of had a good experience across all the different educational sectors in the UK, and that's really helped inform the work we do at Seen and Heard. But I realised around 40, when I had an emotional breakdown myself, that there was a really lasting impact of my time at boarding school that I hadn't addressed at any point leading up to that. I'd had 20 years of therapy, psychotherapy and counselling from 20 to 40, but the topic had never really come up. It had always focused on the stuff that was happening in my life at the time. So as I started to dig and unravel a little bit more of what was behind my difficulties, my anxiety, my workaholism, my alcoholism, and all the other things that led to my breakdown, there was boarding school, and finding the work through my coach Piers Cross of people like Nick Duffel and Joy Shaberian, who wrote very meaningful books on boarding school syndrome and the impact of boarding schools. I was able to start to unpick that going away to an institution at 7 years old, away from your family, was very traumatic, and when you get there, you have to learn to survive, and that survival personality that you build for yourself stays with you in your life and can affect and colour everything that you do in your adult life, up until the point at which you start to realise it's there and sort of take healing measures to make change. As I went through that personal journey of healing, I realised that I found it very difficult to access and find all the materials I needed to help with my journey. So to find the right coaches or therapists to work with, to find the right books and videos and self-help, and what I wanted to do was to try and bring my last 20 years of work experience, if you like, in marketing and running companies to the healing of people who'd been through the system. So working with a number of other directors, Andrew and Toby, we started Seen and Heard at the beginning of this year, and it's been an amazing journey so far. So we're only we're less than a year old, but we're already supporting hundreds of ex-pupils, primarily to find online connection groups, support groups, to fund and find the right therapists, specialist therapists. And then we're now moving into working with the schools to help the current pupils with wellbeing, pastoral care, emotion coaching, and to start campaigning, particularly around abuse legislation in the UK, where sadly a lot of the people that come to our services experienced sexual, physical, emotional abuse in the institutions they went through. And so we're very passionate about campaigning for change there. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview about what we're up to.
Yeah, but I just want to touch upon about your experience at boarding school. Obviously, you mentioned about the challenges that you've experienced, but can you mention like specific gaps in mental health support that you identified, particularly for those with boarding school backgrounds? Because you imagine that if you're in that kind of school, there would be a lot of support available. Is that the case?
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. It's a really good question, because I think the kind of common misconception, if you like, of the boarding and independent school sector, because it's largely elite boarding schools is what people think of. They're an awful lot of money to attend. People think that the mental health provision in those schools is going to be really good. Things have come a long way. So if you go to these schools now, they may well have therapists and counsellors on staff. They may well have a wellbeing program. In our experience so far, they're behind their state school equivalents on mental health, because it hasn't been as highly regarded as academic standards, qualifications, sporting, music, art. So it kind of plays second fiddle, and there's a bit of a tick box exercise sometimes compared to those other factors. But that's now. If you go back even 10, 15 years, let alone 40 or 50 years, where some of the people that use our service, when they came through the sector in the 60s and 70s, the institutions were extremely brutal places to be in the main. There were some that were more benign than others, and there were some that were more extreme than others. But most people who came through the boarding system in anywhere from sort of the 50s right the way through to the 90s and early noughties will have experienced a level of not only separation from parents, because if you're put into an institution, you're not at home. So you've got the separation from parents side of things. You've got the kind of institution sponsored system, so which might involve older pupils being able to control and manage the younger pupils, which often led to obviously abuse and neglect. And you've got the fact that the schools themselves were really set up to sort of break you down and build you back up in the image of the school, kind of creating emotionally cauterized soldiers of empire, if you like. So people who were able to operate in any environment and largely on their own, and that requires a level of shutting down of emotions and of self, and that is very much sits behind boarding school syndrome, if you like, which is around the kind of abandonment, bereavement, captivity, and dissociation from emotion that you need to be able to survive in an institution like that. So even if, like I didn't experience any sexual abuse at school, thankfully. Sadly, an awful lot of people that use our service did, either from staff or pupils, or they experienced very brutal physical abuse. But I can certainly speak to the neglect. It was very cold, there wasn't a lot of food, and you were away from home. So it was anything that happened during the day. There was no going home and closing the door and having quiet time or talking to your parents or anything like that. You were in that environment 24/7, and as a result, you learn very quickly to survive. Your kind of meerkat, your fight or flight response is pretty much always turned on to look, scanning for danger, and that was and is the kind of key thing that I see in people who've been through the system, if you like, the institutions, is anxiety, is difficulty in relationships as an adult because there was no one there to model relationships for you, tends to be the coping strategies of things like alcohol addiction, workaholism, issues with relationships, and other addictions and coping strategies. So it's a kind of a lot of our work is to dispel the myth that if you attended one of these schools you were privileged, because ultimately, yes, there were elements of it where you could get a great education, not in all cases, but in some, and the sports facilities and opportunities might have been good, for instance, but without parents on hand, and with an institution that largely put the needs of itself ahead of its children in its care, there was an awful lot of damage done, and that is more comparable in many cases to coming through the state care system and the state care homes than it might be the image that people have of kind of Hogwarts and pillow fights and midnight feasts and all the stuff that the kind of literary world might tell you about. So I hope that helps sort of sum it up a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. But what's the core objectives of Seen and Heard, given your experience and given what you've seen from other people with similar backgrounds? Um, I would imagine that Seen and Heard doesn't just function as a sort of a complaint club. Are you campaigning for, like, for boarding schools to be abolished? What's your take on that?
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. We've got three pillars that we work to at Seen and Heard. The first one is supporting ex-pupils.
Hmm.
So we are calling for the schools themselves to establish ex-pupil wellbeing funds. A lot of them have benevolent funds or charitable sort of parts that look after ex-pupils. We're asking for them to support the wellbeing and emotional health of ex-pupils who may have suffered as a result of time in the institutions. And we do that through providing free online connection groups via our website where people can meet others who've been through the same experience and share. And there's an awful lot of healing that can be done there, particularly in groups. We also have a specialist therapist directory who are made up of people who've trained in this area. They might have worked with Nick Duffel and been through the boarding school syndrome training, if you like, the unmaking of them, or they may have experience, just considerable professional experience, because it is quite a unique and challenging area of therapy to have, if you like, due to the fact that the people coming to see you are going to have defense mechanisms on top of layers on top of addictions potentially and challenging day-to-day stuff, but ultimately there will be a young part of them locked away still in a school somewhere that needs to be worked with. The inner child needs to be worked with and released. So we connect people to these specialist therapists, and if people don't have the means to pay for their care, which sadly many don't, this kind of myth that people who've been to boarding school are all going to be rich and have great jobs and sadly doesn't play out. Many do. Many who come to use our service are homeless and jobless, and as a result, we at Seed and Head can help them meet the cost of their care to see someone start to heal. So that's the first pillar, is looking after ex-pupils, if you like, if they need support. The second pillar is trying to make things better now. So we have a couple of outreach projects. One is with university counselling services, where particularly with universities that take a lot of ex-boarders, a lot of independent school pupils, to make their counselling services aware of boarding school syndrome, of issues that might be presenting, with young people, that's sort of 18, 19, 20 at university. They're going to be showing up. They won't be showing up saying, I had a terrible time at boarding school, I got boarding school syndrome. They're going to be showing up with anxiety, depression, eating disorders, addictions, suicidal thoughts. But we raise awareness so that those therapists and counsellors who are seeing these young people can ask the right questions, which is, where did you go to school? What was that like for you? Certainly when I went to uni counselling when I was 20 years old as an alcoholic, no one asked me for the next 20 years where I went to school or what happened to me at school. So that was 20 years of therapy and counselling where no one asked, which is quite remarkable. So we raise awareness amongst uni counselling. And then a big one for us is working with the schools themselves. So you asked about abolishing, boarding schools and things like that. We're a harm reduction service at Seen and Heard. So our mission is to go into the schools, encourage them to set up a wellbeing fund for ex-pupils, and encourage them to implement better welfare and wellbeing standards for the current kids. So the young people that are there at the moment, to check safe, for all the way from safeguarding through to emotion coaching, compassionate leadership of the future programs, and just trying to ensure that those young people are resourced as best as we can. That being said, you won't find many developmental psychologists who think it's a good idea to send young people off to an institution voluntarily. If it absolutely cannot be helped, and in the state care system, for instance, if parents are not able to be supported in the community with their children, there are steps to fostering. Beyond fostering, there are care homes, etc. But obviously in the independent and the elite boarding system, parents are voluntarily giving up their children to in loco parentis to these schools at a very young age, and that no matter how benign the school environment is or how many well-being programs there are, that will still have an impact on the child. They will still not have caregivers around. There will be an absence of appropriate touch, which we know touch starvation is incredibly detrimental to all human beings. And they will be raised in an institution that largely puts its own needs ahead of its children. So yeah, it's we work within the current setup, if you like, to try and support things. So that's the second pillar, and then the third pillar is campaigning. So at the moment we have campaigns to try and improve the legislative landscape in England and Wales, particularly with regards to child sexual abuse. So supporting adult survivors of abuse and improving legislation to help young people now. It's 2 years on since the independent inquiry into child sex abuse finished. 2 years ago, the ICSA inquiry. Absolutely nothing's been done on any of the recommendations. And so some of those, particularly things like the mandatory reporting, the suspicion of sexual abuse to a child, or the establishment of a child protection authority. There are live campaigns now that we're supporting with Mandate Now on mandatory reporting, with the Survivors Trust and Act on ICSA and the ICSA Changemakers. So there's a number of campaigns going on right now that we support. And really what we're trying to do is get the government to act on those recommendations from the inquiry and do something to protect children. It is remarkable in the UK that it's not illegal to fail to report the sexual abuse of a child, and we're one of a very small percentage globally who don't have some sort of mandatory reporting law in place.
And Chris, just out of interest, because I was looking at your website, most of people behind Seen and Heard are men. Actually, all of you are men. So I was wondering, like, what kind of people are you supporting? Are they mostly men, or it's an even split?
Yeah, it's a dead even split. In fact, at the moment, going through our connection groups, we've got a majority of women. So we actually have a distinct women's group, whereas we don't have a distinct men's group. So it's about 55% female going through. It just so happens that the three founding directors are men, Toby, Andrew and I. But we've got an enormous panel of advocates and supporters and ambassadors, and we've got a very good gender split across there. But we are looking for more directors as we scale up, and I think improving the diversity of our board is a key important feature for us. But we find that with regards to self-referring to us, if you like, which is what happens now for adults, is that so far women have been more likely to come forward and ask for support than some of their male counterparts, who have found it more difficult to reach out and ask for help. But that's only in our experience so far within the last year.
Is that because there's still a bit of a reluctance among men to seek mental health support? Do you think that affects your kind of reaching out to men who have similar backgrounds?
Absolutely does. Yeah, I mean, it's in general in sort of British culture, if you like, the stiff upper lip that was really created by the boarding school system and by the elite kind of classes, the ruling classes, if you like, is a dissociation from emotions. And so if you dissociate from your emotions, then you're not going to go and be vulnerable and ask for support. Now, things have got an awful lot better, we know, in the last 10, 15 years on mental health. It's an active conversation now, and it's, thank goodness, it's incredibly important. But we do find, not only do you take the general British stiff upper lip, but then if you take someone who's actually been through the original system that created it, through the boarding schools, you've kind of got an extra layer on top of that usually only starts to crack in middle age and onwards. So it tends to need to, one of the main ways that, let's say, a person would come and find our services would be that they've had a significant life, mental or physical breakdown. They've lost a job or had a relationship collapse. Or they've, just reached sort of rock bottom on an addiction or something like that. And at that point, they'll start to look at their stuff. And out of that look at their stuff, they may well start to realize that, going away at a young age to an institution that may well have been violent and neglectful is a part of why they're feeling the way they do. So, but that awakening process, or as the author, Person Irresponsible, says, dropping out of the delusion that it was the best years of your life and it was the making of you and what a fantastic and privileged education and that side of things, that kind of awakening takes time and high pressure life forces often to come out. And so we have people all through their journey using our services. It could be the first day that they realized that maybe school had something to do with it, right the way through to people who've been doing personal work for 20, 30 years, who are still working through their stuff about what it was to go away to an institution.
What about from your own experience, Chris? You mentioned that it has affected you, but I'm quite interested about how this affected your roles as a husband and a parent.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, taking parenting, I've got twin 13-year-old girls, and I had a son, Ben, who died when he was 4 as well, very sadly. And so, from a parenting perspective, as the boarding school side of things, I didn't have a lot of time at home. My life before boarding school was quite chaotic at home. There was a very messy divorce. My mum wasn't emotionally well. She was a drinker. My dad worked. I was, spent a lot of time at work. So when I went off at 7, I was a relatively detached child already, and then going into an institution. So I didn't really see parenting modelled around me. You're taught very much in a boarding school to sort of stiff up a lip, just get on with it. If you're hurt, you get back up quickly. You don't cry. You can't be angry. You can't be sad. You can't be too happy. You just kind of keep a baseline emotion. And so I took that into my parenting, my adult relationships. And at my worst with my kids, I was controlling. I was, overly critical. They call them like tiger parents, sort of pushing for educational kind of excellence and being hard on kids. And, if they fell over and hurt themselves, you didn't rush over and give them a cuddle. You kind of, come on, up you get, let's get on with it. And that was how I was raised. And that's what I put onto my kids until 3 years ago when I had my breakdown. And since then, my girls say there's old daddy and new daddy. So old daddy was pre-breakdown, very, very loving, very attentive, very present with my kids always, but short-tempered and controlling and a perfectionist, if you like. But in the last years, we've healed a lot together. I had to own all my stuff with them and say, this wasn't you. This was never you. This was always me. And this is why I was like that. Ask their forgiveness and wake up every day and do better when I made mistakes. So the healing in that relationship has been a big part of how I've healed. Same in my relationships with my wonderful partner. Last 2.5 years we've been together. She's had to put up with a lot of my dealing with my stuff, my past. She's been very patient and very loving. But in my marriage before that, to the mother of my children, we divorced 9 years ago, something like that. So I've largely parented the kids as a single household, if you like, when they're with me. When we lost our son, and when my son Ben died, emotionally, I shut down as I was trained to. I also lost my mum when I was 14, and I was already at 14 very, very good at dissociating and shutting down. So I just went to my usual thing of sort of put it away in a box, don't look at it, got up, went to work, parented my twin girls, and of course my then wife, who just lost her son, who needed me to be there for her emotionally, and I wasn't. And that brings me great sadness to say that, but I just didn't know how. It's not an excuse, but it is an explanation.
But you also work as a therapist, as a coach now, Chris. And so you mentioned earlier that at an early age, your coping mechanism was sort of dissociation. But obviously, as a coach, you give people some insights and strategies. So, what insights or strategies have you developed to help others navigate the challenges, the emotional challenges of institutional upbringing?
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. Yeah, I mean, I'm only really here today, if you like, in present format because I found the right coach at the right time during my breakdown. I found a guy called Piers Cross, who's a specialist in working with ex-boarding school people. But what Piers practiced was emotional freedom technique, which is also known as tapping, say trauma or trauma tapping. And just a bit of a demonstration there, but it was life-changing, absolutely life-changing form of energy psychology. In combination with something called matrix re-imprinting, which allows you to work in the subconscious with your inner child, if you like, and sort of heal and self-parent and fix in some ways some of the beliefs and the traumatic memories and things that you've had in your life. So working with Piers as a client, I had a benchmark for something truly amazing that brought someone. I was at my worst during my breakdown. I couldn't leave the house for more than short periods at the time. I was too anxious. I was a complete mess. I was suffering from depersonalization, derealization, very extreme form of dissociation, and coaching with him and those techniques just brought me back to life. So as I was going on through my client journey, I knew straight away, very quickly, within the first 6 months, this is what I had to do with my life. I had to sort of, pay it forward or reach back and support others or whatever you want to call it. So I started training in those modalities. So emotional freedom technique, matrix re-imprinting, and then added on to that performance coaching, sort of more traditional performance coaching. I've been in corporate business for 20 years, so I'd had an awful lot of management training. So I've got professional development, sports psychology stuff in there as well. But principally, my coaching work is helping people to heal from the self-limiting beliefs that they have created for themselves as a result of trauma. Because ultimately, when something happens to you, you have to make a choice how to survive, and it will be a choice made by a very young person usually. And at the time, it was a brilliant solution to a problem. But as we get older, those things that were once solutions sometimes then go on to become problems. So I work with people in one-to-one capacity over Zoom or organizations in groups to support people with EFT. Emotional freedom technique. It's a brilliant self-help tool as well as a therapeutic tool. And I believe it's life-changing. If we could get EFT into schools, if we could get EFT into the general population, I think it's a game changer for humanity. But that's very much my coaching practice. But Seen and Heard takes up an awful lot. It's pretty much a full-time job now, and we've been working largely voluntarily for the last year on it. So at the moment, we're trying to scale it up, professionalize it, to get some grants, trusts, and funds, involved to try and support, because we need money to be able to help more people. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Chris, do you intend to broaden the services to support individuals beyond the boarding school community with Seen and Heard?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we're starting with what we know, which is always really important. Do what you know, do what you love, do what you understand. But Andrew, one of our other directors, has spent his career in the care sector as a social worker, and he's also a NACAS director. And Toby, one of our other directors, spent his life in education. So he was a housemaster, a headmaster, a teacher. And so we have a lot of passion and experience to move into supporting people in phase 2 who are care experienced, who came through the social care system. And we have also ambitions to work on a broader level with improving emotional education in schools. Emotion coaching, compassionate leadership of the future, because we think if this world's facing a crisis, a climate crisis, a societal crisis, and we believe that emotionally balanced and happy, healthy future generations can turn that around. But that's going to take an awful lot of work. So we are just a few people with not a lot of money, and so we have to be have to be understanding of what we can do at the moment. So we're focusing on our sector, but then it's the care sector and broader education, educational, progressive education after that. So thanks for asking.
Yeah. So for anyone who wants to get involved with Seen and Heard, their contact details will be available on the description note. Lovely talking to you, Chris. But before we wrap up, let's end this on a lighter note with some quick fire questions just to get to know you a bit better.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, what were you afraid of as a child?
Spiders. Spiders, the dark, and genies.
Genies. Okay, that's interesting. And what is your favorite word in another language?
Namaste.
And if you hadn't been a therapist or the founder of Seen and Heard, what would you have pursued in your life? Would you have stuck with your marketing career?
I probably would have done that. I was very sort of corporately minded, but thank God for my breakdown, because I get to do something meaningful now.
Mm-hmm. And finally, the floor is all yours. What should people take away from today's conversation?
Yeah, I think just taking away today, just to have a rethink about the idea of privilege from these elite boarding schools and independent school upbringings. Just to challenge the fact that these are just young people sent away to a place where they have to survive, and I think that's quite important. That there is hope out there if you or someone who has been affected is struggling to come to terms with these things. There are support organisations now that are specifically focused on this area because of how prevalent it is, and to take away that the stiff upper lip and the legislative environment that goes along with that in England and Wales right now around things like child sexual abuse and abuse in general is very backwards compared to most developed nations, and it needs challenging. So just inviting people out there to get involved and start to apply people power to the institutions and the powers that be.
Absolutely. That's it for us as we continue to explore innovative approaches to health and well-being. Your insights are incredibly valuable. Chris Braitch, it's been fantastic talking with you here on the DRH show, and I look forward to following your continued contributions and advocacy through Seen and Heard. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dennis. Cheers. Thanks.